Thank you very much, Muyama-san, for a very interesting talk. The idea of putting 685 megawatts in 5 minutes, bring it online, is going to be very, very exciting and interesting. Those tip clearances technology is really going to be very much needed. Now, for the second keynote, we looked at power generation, and power generation is, at the end of the day, when you look at it, how we work, we have primary fuel, our machines, they give us the mechanical drive, the generators, they give electricity, and you have to transmit it and get it to people. People use it. Now, ABB, which is a big company here in Switzerland, they are one of the world leaders in transmission, but they also have a strong activity in microgrids. What are the future structure of the power structure around the world may look like? Large scale and more distributed. To give us a broader perspective, we are honored today to have with us Ms. Maxine Ghavi, Group Senior Vice President and Global Program Director for Microgrid in ABB. She has been more than 25 years experience in business development, product marketing, product management, marketing and sales in various industries, in solar, semiconductor capital equipment, as well as key positions at ABB, Olicon, and Voyan, and KLA Tenco. Now, Maxine, can you come and tell us what is your view of how things are going to evolve in the future?
Good morning. You can hear me okay? Great. Thank you very much. Good morning. First of all, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to really be here amongst the audience and talk about my favorite topic, microgrids. We're going a little bit smaller in scale than what you were talking about earlier. But to really talk about microgrids, I think we need to start with a holistic perspective and what they really are. They've been around for a long time, but they've evolved over time. And today's microgrid is very different than what the microgrids that we had 20 or 30 years ago. So with that, if we look at the energy and grid transformation that's taking place, we're seeing that we're going from a much more centralized to a much more distributed generation and consumption. And therefore, as we see this happening, we're also seeing this transition happening is faster and faster. It's because of new technology, new business models, but also new policies that are enabling this. From our perspective, we see three key global trends. One is generation mix. I think it was referred to yesterday as well, that the generation mix for renewables in terms of their percentage will continue to increase over time. In fact, it's going to be by as much as 40% capacity by 2035. It's wonderful, but it also brings a lot more volatility into the system, a lot more uncertainty that has to be dealt with. But also because renewables, especially solar, lends itself to be distributed so well, we will have far more nodes coming into the system that will also have to be managed. The second one is power transmission and distribution. When we're looking at these renewables again, the larger solar farms and the larger wind farms, the offshore wind, the generation is far away from where the point of consumption is. And the high voltage DC lines will be able to transmit this power to the point of consumption and be able to do that as efficiently as possible. The third one is in the area of micro and nanogrids, and I'll explain those a little bit in a moment. But essentially now we're looking at both on-grid and off-grid applicability and connection, and also in terms of control and automation at the local level. So we're talking about generation at the point of consumption. And one of the key enablers for microgrid is actually storage. So this will be a key component as we go forward, both for grid-connected and off-grid applications. What we've seen in the terms of the trends for distributed energy resources is really we started in this transition with small installations, with a few generation sources. And the system has evolved to apply itself to more commercial installations, which also means there's more sophistication that's needed, more optimization that's needed, and the system size is also getting larger. And then we're going to larger installations with a lot more variety in the distributed energy resource. You have combined heat and power, you now have the grid connection and the grid ancillary services to deal with, and therefore the complexity of the system continues to grow. While at the same time, there is the activity to reduce the cost in parallel. So where does microgrid come in? When we look 10 years down the road, or even 5 years down the road, we will see a lot more microgrids everywhere. And there's a huge participation on their side into the energy and grid transformation. Simply put, what a microgrid is, you take multiple generation sources, multiple loads, and they're running under the same control system with the ability to optimize the resources that are needed. Now, a microgrid can be completely off-grid, and this is what we're all generally used to, remote locations, et cetera. But it also now has to have the ability to be connected to the grid. But if it is connected to the grid, it has to have the capability to disconnect itself and run independently. So again, multiple generation, multiple loads, and the same control system, grid connected with the ability to disconnect or completely off-grid. They also participate in the power grid. And in the sense that where there is a power grid, microgrid can actually strengthen the power grid in terms of reliability and quality. And of course, there's the term that we hear about also, nanogrid. And you also hear the terms microgrid, minigrid, nanogrid. And some of them are actually the same. But nanogrid in itself, if you think about it, it doesn't refer to the size of the system. It actually refers to whether or not it's a single building or more than one building, one load versus multiple. So this is, in general, the perspective of microgrids. And if you look at the drivers, the way we look at it at ABB is, first of all, these are the three categories that I mentioned. You're either grid connected, you're connected to a weak grid, or you are completely off-grid. And if you look at the market segments, these are the general market segments. Some very familiar, such as remote communities or defense industry, but others would be urban communities, institutions, and campuses, and also islands. Typical customers that we see in this space, interestingly enough, are customers that are already in this space, whether they're developers, EPCs, or the private sector that actually participate in this segment. They've transitioned from the neighboring applications and market sectors to this. And in terms of drivers, of course, social, economic, environmental, and operational. Generally, there's the first primary driver, followed by a secondary driver, which really pushes the installation deployment of microgrids. So talking about two different kinds of microgrids. The first one, grid connected. Again, in terms of what's in the microgrid itself, it's the same. You have multiple generation of different types, whether they be conventional, they would be wind, solar, you would have storage also in the system, and of course multiple load, whether they're commercial, residential, all combined. The key is that there is a point of common coupling to the grid. That needs to be there. And if this is cut off, this microgrid has to run independently. Now, why grid-connected microgrids are becoming so popular? Well, one of the primary drivers is grid resiliency and power quality. The biggest driver came after Hurricane Sandy in the U.S., where the northeastern part of the U.S. was without power for about three weeks. What they found were there were a couple of pockets where there were microgrids, and through the microgrid, they were able to provide power to critical loads, the fire department, the hospital, et cetera. So this has, especially with the weather patterns changing and becoming more drastic, this has become a key driver in countries like the U.S. Other key drivers are, of course, aside from the weather and natural disasters, is cybersecurity, which we're starting to see more and more. and of course from a defense perspective against terrorism and other things. So this is one application. The other one for grid-connected application is when you look at countries like India, South Africa, and many other countries where there is grid available. However, the power is not reliable. There are outages, and so therefore many of the sites actually have diesel backup generators. And if you look at, for example, South Africa, they have a lot of power outages, and Eskom, the utility there, has guaranteed that the power cost will continue to rise, roughly at about 8% a year. So with that, there's a huge driver to be able to provide a microgrid that can leverage the grid, generate its own its own power and consume it, and be able to have quality power when the grid is not available. So there is a cost related to this, cost reduction, reducing carbon footprint, but also being able to have access to power 24/7, reliable power at that. When we started to look at microgrids, really, there's no black and white line between microgrids, smart grid, and distributed energy resource management systems. And they're starting to mesh more and more. And we're starting to see also a lot of companies and a lot of capabilities brought into the market in terms of services that makes this even more enabled. So from our perspective, microgrid and smart grid, they each have their own distinctive features. However, they also share some common features that allows them to enable each other. So this is very key, the ability of a microgrid to be able to communicate with the power grid and to actually be able to leverage some of the advantages of what's in the smart grid to operate more efficiently. This is the hybrid or island microgrid, which we're mostly used to. You pretty much, as I said, see a lot of the same components. What you don't see here as in comparison to the previous slide is, in fact, the point of common coupling. Now, village electrification is clearly one of the applications with 1.2 billion people without access to power today. There's also industrial application. If you look at the mining sector, over time, they will be moving further and further away for resources, for mining resources, and therefore further away from the grid. And they will need to have reliable power, so microgrid is a key option there. So those are some of the applications for that. And again, the drivers would be access to power, and especially for critical loads for industrial applications, they would have to be quality power. And of course, cost savings and reducing environmental impact. You know, one of the things that we hear a lot about is that when the cost of fossil fuel goes down, that it becomes a challenge for renewable microgrids especially. And I think one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, unless you're running one of these operations remotely, is the cost of transportation of fuel to those locations. So it's not just cost of the barrel of oil, but it's the cost of transportation, and in certain parts of the world, the reliability of that transportation and how easily you'd be able to have access to that fuel. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of different key drivers. I already mentioned the fuel cost being a key factor there. And the fact that you're now with a microgrid, the volatility of fuel costs goes away. And you're able to plan better, be able to plan for the cost of production of your facility, for your operations better. And renewables are becoming much, much more competitive. As I'm sure all of you know, solar prices have dropped down significantly over the last 5 years, and they're becoming more and more economically viable. Another driver, and when we look at the microgrid, especially as we move forward, more and more microgrids will incorporate renewables into them, is when you have a microgrid, one of the key factors is that you want to leverage the renewable sources and therefore reduce your costs and improve your ROI. Now, renewables are wonderful. They're free. They're clean. They're mostly available, but they're not always available. And also, they're not always stable. So they introduce a lot of instability into the system, whether it's solar or wind. So there has to be a way to actually manage these power fluctuations so you can have a reliable microgrid. This is one of the key factors in controlling a microgrid system and optimizing it while maximizing the penetration of renewables into the microgrid. And of course, the third one for microgrids is maximizing capital efficiency. This is really applicable for the utilities, where they want to defer capital investment. Instead of strengthening their grid, they can actually have an add microgrid at the maybe at the end of the line or within a sector of an urban community to be able to strengthen the microgrid without actually making the investment in the capital. So this is a graphical display of what a microgrid would look like and what the components are. And I've already mentioned many of them. The goals in terms of microgrids, of course, are, as I mentioned, there's reliability, there's power quality, there's availability, there's environmental impact, there's cost reduction. All of that really comes into play. And if we look at the operational goals that I just mentioned, we have what we call the power system functions, or the 8 S's. So your microgrid may or may not want to actually have all of these capabilities, all these 8 S's capabilities in a microgrid. But the point is that you can have all of that available and operating in your microgrid today, which means the microgrids have become far more sophisticated, and therefore they've also become far more reliable and addressing a broader range of applications and requirements. And when you look at the, how these 8 S's apply in terms of application from power to time, they really are in different places on this chart, from grid stabilizations to energy storage. This is why for us as ABB, we are storage medium agnostic, and we leverage whatever technology is most suitable for the application. For example, we have many installations that use flywheel, and we have many installations that use batteries. So it really depends on what the application is and where you want to be on this chart, or where you need to be in this chart in terms of drivers. So it always helps to talk about the definitions and talk about where the market's going, but really bringing it down home to what's actually being done. So this is one of the sites we've done, which was commissioned in 2010. And by the way, ABB has been in the field of microgrids for the last 25 years. So this is one of our largest installations that we actually have that's been operating for quite some time. In terms of what the capabilities there, this is purely a PV diesel remote community and commercial applications that we have in Australia. And what we actually provide, it's a product called Power Store. And this Power Store is basically, as I mentioned, it's either lithium-ion battery-based or it's flywheel-based. And it's basically either provides stabilization or stabilization and storage. Plus the controller, the Microgrid Plus controller that we have. That is a distributed control system which allows us to have the redundancy and therefore increase the reliability. This is another application. This was actually commissioned in 2006. It's a very large mine that was running purely on diesel. And again, for the drivers of reducing cost, but also reducing the carbon footprint, we augmented this site with a solar microgrid. And it basically has the ability now to reduce its fuel consumption, diesel fuel consumption, by 20%. Now, this is a critical load application. They can't see the fluctuations in voltage and frequency that solar brings to the system. Therefore, it always has to run smoothly. It always has to be available. And the transition from one generation to the other has to happen in a very, very smooth manner. This is an example of a community in Kenya where they were running on diesel and they added wind. However, they had to curtail the wind power because it was causing a lot of disturbances into the system. And therefore, again, leveraging the same technology, we're able to maximize the wind power and minimize the diesel fuel by being able to control the system more efficiently. And this is another one that's actually also in Australia for its end of the grid, where the application was that SP AusNet, which is the utility there, is that they wanted to manage the peak demand, active and reactive power. And also, there's a lot of bushfires, as you know, in Australia, and oftentimes these lines come down, the transmission lines come down, and they needed to have this feeder basically run independently when it was when needed. This is an example of what I mentioned in terms of where there is a grid available. However, it's not quality power, and it's not always available. This is one of ABB's sites. It's a manufacturing site that runs continuously. And again, it cannot afford to have the power fluctuations that we have in the grid in South Africa. We had a huge diesel generation capability on site, and we've added solar, we've added storage, and now we're basically able to reduce our cost through self-consumption, but also through the fact that we don't have to keep up with the utilities increasing prices, but also be able to increase the renewables there and also the power quality there. With that, I thank you very much.